Welcome to Perspective and Potential, where we uncover new ways to see the world and tap into the incredible potential within each of us. I'm Abigail Strait, joined by my co-host and mother, Gwen Fund, and together we'll explore ideas, stories, and strategies designed to help you grow, shift your perspective, and embrace a more complete version of yourself. So whether you're ready for a big transformation or simply curious about the small steps you can take today, our goal is to inspire, encourage, and support you on your journey. If you'd like to learn more about us, you can check us out at perspectiveandpotential.com. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in and see where a new perspective might take you. Today, we're diving into a topic that touches every aspect of our lives: happiness. While happiness can sometimes feel like an elusive or fleeting goal, research and wisdom tell us that certain attributes are consistently shared by people who are truly happy. One of the most foundational of these attributes is gratitude. But what does it really mean to be grateful? Is it just saying thank you, or is there something deeper at play? And more importantly, how can we intentionally cultivate gratitude in a way that not only transforms how we feel, but also shapes who we want to become? In this episode, we're peeling back the layers of gratitude, what it is, how it works, and why it's such a powerful force for happiness. So, let me start by asking you this question. Why do you think gratitude plays such a critical role in happiness?
Well, the Roman philosopher Marcus Tullius Cicero is credited with this quote: "Gratitude is not only the greatest of virtues, but the parent of all others."
So, do you think this is because gratitude naturally opens the door to other positive emotions like empathy or generosity?
Well, if Cicero is correct, and we do know that gratitude is one of the defining characteristics of a happy person, it seems that cultivating this virtuous attribute is a great place for a person to start in their own personal pursuit of happiness. And if it is the parent of all other virtues, we should find that other virtues will follow almost naturally, because it's easier to be kind to other people when we recognize kindness from other people. And it's easier to be helpful to other people when we acknowledge how others help us, and so forth and so on. We can start to grow some positive personal connections with other people. And that is the number one indicator of happiness in all of us, is our personal connections. So in its simplest form, I guess we could say that gratitude is just not taking anything for granted.
That's interesting. Why do you think that people often fall into the trap of taking things for granted? It is so easy to do.
Oh, it is. We get on our automatic pilot, or sometimes we just get so overwhelmed with our own personal troubles and turmoil around us that we forget to notice the myriad of good and wonderful things that make our life worth living. We get tunnel vision, basically. But gratitude is really a lot more than just taking notice of the good in our universe. It really has to involve real appreciation, approval, admiration, and attention. We think of gratitude more like a noun, but we need to view it more like a verb. Taking notice is only the first step in a three-part action of growing gratitude in our lives. So first, of course, is acknowledging a particular thing that we're grateful for. Second, and this is the important one, we need to express that gratitude for that particular thing. A lot of people do that through prayer, writing in a gratitude journal, or taking the time to write a personal note or have a personal discussion with someone who has done something that you're grateful for. Finally, the last step is to integrate that particular thing into a positive memory bank. We need to remember all the things that bring joy to our life. And like any bank account, we want to make more deposits in that than the negative withdrawals. So be mindful to pay attention, as much attention to the positive things in our life as we do the negative. Our amygdala, of course, is trained to see what's wrong. It's supposed to protect us. So it does its job very well automatically. But we have to actively look for what is right in our universe. Also, we need to realize that there's different kinds of gratitude. Uh, Personal gratitude is the most common. We're grateful for things that we receive. But there's one called interpersonal gratitude toward others. And that's just being grateful for the people who add something to our world: mentors, confidants, companions, children. I mean, the list goes on and on. Our world is enriched by other people and other things, and we need to be grateful for those enrichments. Then the last one is transpersonal. And we'll find in happy people, spirituality is another component of people who are organically happy. And that interpersonal gratitude, or that transpersonal gratitude, rather, is one that increases our spirituality. It's the opportunity for life that we're grateful for inspiration and guidance that we receive throughout our life, the temporal and spiritual blessings that surround us, our ability to learn, to grow, and to change. Those are not things that we can actually do on our own. Those are gifts that we've been given, and we need to be grateful for those.
In all of those things that you were saying, and especially the action steps. And if I go back to how we started out talking about how happy people have attitudes of gratitude, so to speak. It got me thinking recently. So we lost one of our dogs, and he had been in the family for about 10 years. So and during the prime growing up years for my kids, and so it was a hard thing to go through. And so to say that that anybody would have said at the time, maybe to define the moment, happy probably would not have been the word. But as I was having a conversation with one of my sons, the language was a little bit slanted towards why my dog, why did this have to happen now? And so we had a conversation, and we stopped and we paused and we said, hey, let's talk about this, because it is okay to be sad. It is okay to feel grief and to feel like you've lost something. But I think in those times where maybe we're going through something challenging, it can become a slippery slope to take for granted all of the things that we have to be grateful for, even in that moment. And so what we did was an exercise in shifting our perspective. And we just talked about, okay, well, hey, instead of thinking about why me, why now, why so fast, it seemed to be a sudden thing. We could choose to think about, man, I really loved it when, we used to take him to the park and throw the frisbee, or I really loved how, like, he loved to sleep at the foot of my bed. Those little things, in that moment actually made us feel happy to recall the good times that we'd had. And so I think, in terms of when we talk about happiness, there are going to be situations in our life where we're not going to feel joyful, and that's okay. But it is important. And what I really want all of us to know is that it is important to know that it is still possible to have gratitude.
Absolutely. And, you may be sad, um, but that doesn't mean you have an unhappy life.
Right, right. It's the perspective, right?
Yeah.
So what's going on inside of our heads when we then practice gratitude, when we make that choice to exercise those steps that you talked about?
Well, when we cultivate gratitude, our brains release serotonin and dopamine,
Mm.
which helps reduce pain levels, both physically and emotionally. So it increases also the amount of oxytocin as we're connecting with others. So your son was in grief, and if you happen to put your arm around him during that discussion, he actually made more oxytocin, and so did you, than you would normally. But I think the really important thing that's happening in our brain is that the connections to the part of the brain associated with positive emotions become strengthened as we cultivate gratitude, whereas the connections to the negative emotions in our brain are weakened.
Mm.
And that fact alone is really reason enough to give this a try.
So it's fascinating then that gratitude doesn't just make us happier, but it also has the ability to improve our physical health. So, what health benefits, as we talked about some of the things that we can do to express our gratitude, um, you mentioned gratitude journals. What health benefits do you think have been associated with keeping a gratitude journal?
So, as our brain releases those positive endorphins, gratitude seems to help lessen depression. And of course, we already talked about how it facilitates better relationships with others. Both of these things make us less likely to engage in unhealthy behaviors that can impact our health. So, chronic stress is a destroyer at our very cellular structure and therefore to our physical health. The chemical production from practicing gratitude alleviates some of that chronic stress cycle that many of us experience. Surprisingly, even things like heart disease can be positively affected by keeping a gratitude journal.
Wow. And with that in mind, it seems like what's the worst that could happen? It's worth just starting.
Right.
If nothing else, then let's, to see what benefits might come from it. One of the other things that I know to be true about actually writing um, is the coding process that takes place in our brain. So, actually taking the time to slow our brain down to
And
write.
writing does do that.
Yeah. Right. So it's writing is that act of not just a fleeting thought that's going through your head, but when you slow down, and this is why in education, um, writing is so important. Writing down, even sometimes in math, students will say, "Why do I have to write in math?" Well, because writing helps us think something all the way through and codes it to our brain. And in this aspect of writing a gratitude journal, I feel like for me, it brings clarity to the priorities in my life. So, for someone who's never tried it, what advice would you give to get started with a gratitude journal?
Okay, first, understand and believe
Mhm.
that gratitude journals really work. So start with a little notebook. Keep it handy, like in your purse or your pocket or whatever. Jot down little things throughout the day that brought you joy or happiness. Someone smiling at you, a child brought you a flower, compassion from a friend or a colleague at work, or a love note from your companion. But as that habit strengthens, then you can graduate to a real journal that you write in the evenings, where you can recall the events of the day and the good things that happen. But to me, the best part of a gratitude journal is being able to go back and reread the entries whenever you hit those turbulent times in your life. It is amazing how reminding ourselves through our gratitude journals and how that can lift our spirits and bring us back to a positive mindset.
I think it can, yeah, it can bring us back to a positive mindset. It's also really encouraging to see growth that you've had. And sometimes I think as you know, I love how you said you can start small. You can start with just a little journal, a little pocket, something. If you do kind of graduate that to writing about full experiences and the gratitude that you have, I think it's really, really impactful. How you watch your growth take place. It's really, if you're diligent, and there's been seasons in my life when I have been, and there's been season in my life when I have not been. But when I have been diligent, I love to go back and see if I can find a year ago today what was going on in my life, right? And just in 1 year, right? I don't know what a year, a month, whatever, but it's fun to go back 1 year and say, where was I at? And look at something and look at the growth that you've had in your own personal life from that situation, right? Something that may have seemed super challenging at the time. And you look back and you're like, oh, well, I, uh, I remember how I felt, but man, if future me could go back and tell them it's going to be okay, right? Then I think that would also help. That helps give you the perspective that some of the turbulent times in our life, they're seasonal, right?
Yep.
It
Like a
time will go up.
storm, it comes and it goes.
Exactly.
So we do tend to see things in the negative. I mean, that's just unfortunately, the way we're programmed. Um, but you can see that your life is not completely negative. You can see that it's not completely true, that there are good things that happen all around us. We just need to notice and acknowledge them.
So, are there any roadblocks though that we might run into as we start trying, right? Just like any goal, right? Okay, we put one foot in front of the other and we're taking a step towards being more grateful. But what roadblocks might we run into as we start trying to cultivate the virtues of gratitude in our lives?
Oh, gratitude definitely has some arch enemies out there. Self-pity, complaining, comparing, isolating, and entitlement. If we find ourselves complaining all the time, that is totally the opposite of gratitude, right? So
Right.
these attitudes essentially close us off to being able to see the positives in our life.
And I think that's important to just be aware of as you head into a season where, you know what, I am going to live my life and be more grateful. I'm going to start a gratitude journal. And then it's very easy for that first roadblock to come up and then all of a sudden be like, well, how can I be grateful if this is, entering my life? Or if this is happening to me. And it's interesting, you mentioned self-pity, complaining, comparing, isolation, and entitlement. Isolation kind of strikes me because if you think about it for a second, I totally recognize how that can be true to crippling our ability to be grateful. When we're isolated, when we're not out there, when we're not making those connections, we cut off a lot of opportunities, right? And then our view becomes myopic and we get really focused on ourselves. And little by little, I think it becomes easier and easier, like you said, with the amygdala to focus on the negative things. Do you think that one of these attitudes is more common or challenging to overcome than the others?
Well, in counseling, I know we see a lot of unhappy people who've adopted what we call the victim mentality. Essentially, it does involve several of those little arch enemies like complaining, comparing, self-problem or self-pity. But the real problem with a victim mentality is that it convinces the person that they have no power to change their circumstance, that everything is somebody else's fault. It becomes a blame game in order to excuse their own resistance to making positive changes in their life. Change is hard. People have a hard time changing from this automatic pilot thing that we live in. Sometimes they really don't know how to make the changes that they need to make, or maybe it just seems too difficult and it's just easier to blame somebody or something else for their misery. Unfortunately, it's always going to take personal effort and resolve to overcome this kind of mentality. But a gratitude journal is a great place to start. It can trigger, those positive thoughts that they so desperately need. Entitlement, on the other hand, convinces a person that they have no need to change, that the world should change to meet their own expectations.
Huh. You know, when you talk about the victim mentality, I feel like that's a common thread nowadays, to victimize ourselves. And even scrolling across social media, I feel like there's a lot of opportunities where we can be convinced that we are victims, which is actually the opposite of being the master of our universe. And these arch enemies are self-defeating traps. So that's what I love about the journal, is that it literally puts the control back in our hands. And then the first step is just catching ourselves when we start to fall victim to one of those traps or that victim mentality, and recognize the language so that we can reframe our perspective.
Well, I do need to clarify too, though, that I think we need to remember it is true that we can be victimized by other people's actions.
Mhm.
There are real instances out there where people are taken advantage of or abused, um, and they come from backgrounds that have given them dysfunctional coping techniques. We all have troubles and sorrows. But the difference between a happy person and an unhappy person is how long they allow themselves to stay in that negative mindset and to stay in that victim mode. Um, Gratitude will help us crawl out of our self pity, and it will see the possibilities for changes that we could make for more joy and happiness in our life.
And that's a good point. And a fair point, because that it is very true that we make choices, but so do others. And sometimes we might fall victim to the choices. We might be victimized. I like that term. We might be victimized by others' choices. However, I think it's also important to note where our power comes back into play. And I think the perfect example, I'm going to go back to Viktor Frankl here. He had great success prior to ever becoming a prisoner in Auschwitz. He was well known. He had achieved a lot of success in his career and lost it all, lost everything, lost his family members. And even in that time period where he was victimized by the actions of others, he noticed when he was in Auschwitz that there were people who were coming into the camp, and they and the newcomers would experience such shock for the environment that they were thrown into with, nothing was their choice here. And he recognized in that moment that there was still something he could do, something that he could give. And so he worked with a couple of other people in the camp to put together a support program. And essentially when newcomers would come to the camp, they had a process and a way for integrating these individuals into the camp. And this attitude, this mindset of being grateful and seeing where he could help those around him is ultimately what he credits as his reason for being able to make it out of Auschwitz.
Yeah, he was in tune with at least one positive thing that could be done in there.
Uh-huh. Right. So, thinking of that, and some of the things that we might go through, and everything that we've talked about, how it's so easy to take things for granted, and it's easy to succumb to those arch enemies of gratitude. Are there any quick strategies where we can flip the script, so to speak, when we start to do that first step and we catch ourselves in a moment of self-pity, complaining, entitlement? What can we do to flip the script?
So we talk a lot about triggers, and we usually think about that word in a negative sense. But we can also use triggers to our advantage. Almost all of our behaviors are linked to something. We get up at a certain time. We eat certain foods. We have comfortable routines. All triggers are attached to something, whether that's a thought, a memory, or even something tangible. But I think that is where things like taking that deep breath, writing in a gratitude journal, or seeking positive support need to be tied to those negative feelings. Just like we talked about in our first episode, when we get, that stimulus, right? That stimulus is that feeling. And at that juncture there, we have the opportunity to either react or respond. Well, I think when we have these negative feelings, when the world seems to be closing in on us, that we can catch ourselves going down one of those rabbit holes. That feeling can be tied to a positive response instead of a negative reaction. So it does take personal resolve and effort, but anything that we do habitually kind of becomes second nature. And so at the very beginning, it's going to be really hard. But when we feel ourselves feeling that self-pity or having that need to complain or blame or whatever, if we can, at that very moment, go write in a gratitude journal, make ourselves think about things that are positive in our life, and try and get out of that negative mindset, we'll do ourselves a great favor and start a habit that can bless and enrich our life for the rest of our life.
And maybe, we don't see the real fruits of that day by day, but like we talked about, if you go back and reflect, you will see how much your mindset has changed by just those daily practices and that consistency.
Yep.
Well, as we come to a close, let's pinpoint the most crucial points from our talk and consider how do they apply to our daily lives. So first, gratitude is an active process. We have to notice, express, and remember. Gratitude has physiological benefits to our brain and our future overall well-being. So some negative habits seem to block the doorway to cultivating gratitude in our universe, such as self-pity, complaining, entitlement, or isolation. If we give pause, cultivating gratitude fosters other virtues like hope, contentment, cheerfulness, kindness, compassion, personal connection, and spirituality. In our next episode, we are going to explore the topic of forgiveness. If you'd like to learn more about this podcast, be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts or suggestions for topics for future episodes through our website and social media. Your input helps shape the conversation and makes perspective and potential even more impactful. We're Gwen and Abby, and you've been listening to Perspective and Potential. Until next time, keep exploring new perspectives and remember that every small change can lead to something big. Food for thought. Bon appetit.